Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let me please wax poetic for a while on nihilism and postmodernism and those things specifically in Hollywood movies. A while back, I made a video called Why Do Hollywood Movies Suck? And if you didn't see that, here's the thesis. They suck mostly for market reasons. And what that means is that, as markets change, as you're playing to a more international market, that demands like a little bit different product. And that product may be a little more heavy on special effects and set pieces and a little bit simpler on story, not have as much nuanced dialogue because those things don't necessarily translate that well to like the Chinese market. And so you kind of want to make sure that you're gathering that wide audience. And as also as like revenues fall at theaters, you want to gather as wide an audience. The other half of what I said there was basically the people experience a lot of bias with their memory. They kind of forget about the bad movies of the past and don't really remember them clearly, but remember the bad movie that they saw last week. And while I think I'm correct with both of those, I think those explanations are also insufficient. And just like with any theory, you call it insufficient when it fails to explain all the phenomena that are being observed. So in this case, the phenomena that I am seeing a lot of is bad writing in movies. And I'm not talking about writing of like, the story takes a back seat and it's simpler. I mean like things that really don't make any sense. You would think it's just a lack of care about the story, and that's probably true. But like with Last Jedi, you have whole pieces of the plot which could have been avoided had anybody acted like a normal human being. And if anybody had acted the way that we would expect them to act. Instead, like the motivations are erratic and all over the place and don't seem genuine. They seem kind of impressed upon us. And I think for me, the sort of core that I saw with that movie, and I think you can apply this to lots of movies actually. I've seen with lots of other more recent movies, even movies in, the sort of Marvel sphere, is this inability to understand morality. It's a nihilism. It's not that they're trying to communicate a nihilist world. They are nihilists and so are incapable of creating a world with meaning, if that makes any sense. So it's not like they're promoting nihilism. It's that a nihilist literally can't see what right and wrong are. And by the way, if I'm using terms here that are just maybe slightly different from how you use them or you've used them, keep in mind I learned them in different contexts, and you're free to talk about the semantics in the comments section about nihilism and postmodernism. My understanding of nihilism is really just it's a nothingness when it comes to morality. If we're talking about moral nihilism, this sort of Nietzschean nihilism that comes after you kill God, after you remove the source of decency and morality, what happens? What's the horror that happens after that? So that sort of nihil, that nothingness, is not what most people think nihilism is. I find most people think nihilism is actually Satanism. And those are different things. The satanic moral system is actually still a moral system. And I'm not talking about Luciferan worship of like the Christian devil. I mean an adversarial moral system. So if you say, hey, it's wrong to murder, the satanic version is it's right to murder. You should murder. Now, if you say you should murder, that's still a moral directive, right? You still have a moral system. A nihilist doesn't interact with that at all. They don't interact with any sort of moral questions. It's like dark matter and regular matter kind of just passes through and doesn't interact and nothing happens. And so because a nihilist, a true nihilist, is basically like a sociopath, right? And socioapathy is probably, a result of nihilism. And I'm not a psychologist, but you can draw your own connections there. A nihilist just isn't capable of seeing right and wrong at all. So if you have a movie that requires an understanding of right and wrong, what you end up doing is sort of just imitating the moments you saw before, thinking that that's what is communicating this right and wrong idea, which you're incapable of understanding. So the moral conflict of the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy in Star Wars is essentially like this competition between two moral systems, not like a moral system and its satanic inverse, but a deontological ethical system and a consequentialist ethical system. So the deontological one is the Jedi Order, which is like right is right. Here's the way that we do things. It's a process-oriented morality. And then you have the Sith, which is an objective, a consequence consequence-ordered morality. So the Sith are evil because they are doing evil things to accomplish their ends. They have a goal in mind, and the goal is what matters, and anything you do to accomplish that goal is fine. That's consequentialist ethics. Whereas the Jedi Order has this code, and you have to adhere to the code. And we can see that with the original trilogy for certain, especially with like in Empire Strikes Back. You have at the end Darth Vader saying, join me and we'll put an end to this destructive conflict. And that is basically Vader communicating this ends versus means thing. Is that I'm achieving a good end here called the peace of the galaxy. I'm doing something right, and you should join me in this. But he's doing it through betrayal. He's doing it by lying. He's lied throughout the film. He kills people at will, inflicts his fear upon others, and goes through this elaborate setup to capture his son, whom he then dismembers, because it's not about him caring for his family so much as him seeing this family as a tool to achieve that, or a tool to overthrow his own master, the Emperor, and inflict his own kind of order. So it's very interesting in that way. It's this conflict. And then in the original trilogy, you have Anakin essentially seduced by the idea of life in the here and now being given through this dark side. It's a means to an end, and that's kind of how I saw that moral conflict. And so, is that expressed in Last Jedi? It's really not expressed in Last Jedi, but we have a lot of these moments kind of abstracted from these older movies and kind of placed in different spots, and we kind of feel like we've seen them before, but they don't make sense in context. It's like, well, Luke isn't doing anything that makes sense. We have the ghost of Yoda appear, and spoilers, the ghost of Yoda appears, and he just burns down this ancient Jedi temple in the books, which isn't something Yoda would normally do, because Yoda is a detached, process-oriented, light side Jedi, and Luke is likewise had been attempting to be that in the original trilogy, and through his unrelenting compassion for his father, he saved his father. It's really a means thing, versus him sort of embracing the dark side to defeat the Emperor. He never did that. In fact, he came to the brink and stopped and turned back, and it was compassion that saved him, which is really interesting. So I think that Rian Johnson, might be a nihilist, and the greater studio might be just packed with people that are incapable of seeing that moral conflict for what it is. They actually are nihilists. Now, how do people get to be nihilists, really? I don't think that they are promoting nihilism. Let me say that. Because I don't think that you can consciously promote nihilism and say that nihilism is good. Because as soon as you say that nihilism is good, you're creating a moral standard, right? A nihilist is kind of like a sociopath. It's like you're unaware, like you're not interacting with the moral conflict. That's how I view it. So I don't think it's like they're trying to promote nihilism. Some people say, like with postmodernism, they're trying to subvert the established conservative order. I think that's a little bit different discussion than what I'm thinking about today, and maybe we can do that in a follow-up, or maybe I can try to collect some thoughts on that. But I think as far as this like promotion of nothingness, like this nonsense, I think that really stems from a nihilistic worldview. And I think a lot of people still like the movie because they don't have any values themselves. And so we're in an interesting place where there's a huge generation in the West, the daycare generation, kids that are essentially raised without values. Their parents might have been hippies and therefore were satanic. And of course, people will say that like hippies weren't satanic. It's like, well, think about some of the hippie moral maxims, like what you should do, what you ought to do in the hippie sphere. And you'll see it's like, oh, you ought to have free love. Well, you ought to be anti-monogamous. Well, that's a satanic inversion of monogamy. You ought to do drugs and expand your mind. Well, that's a satanic inversion of sobriety, right? Saying it's good to do drugs is the opposite of it is good to be sober, right? Or it's good to do things in moderation. So you have essentially a generation of people whose values are satanic who don't even raise their kids. A lot of them end up in daycare. Then you go to public school, and maybe you stay after school in daycare after public school. And at the end of the line, you've spent more time with strangers than you have with your parents. Add to this multiculturalism. Multiculturalism, I think, goes hand in hand with nihilism. I think it promotes nihilism because you put a bunch of people in a room that all have different value systems, and you have to teach them. You have to keep that classroom working, and you have to keep everybody happy and not get everybody too upset that you're trying to promote one thing or another in terms of value system. And so what you end up promoting in school is no value either. And if you get a million different conflicting messages and you're constantly told that multiculturalism is good and all cultures are valid and cultural relativism is the reality, you're essentially destroying that person's capacity to maintain values that they think are the best. And that's really, by the way, this is another thing that I get a lot in comment section is the relativist argument. And that is where they say, your opinion can't be right because no opinion can be right. It's all subjective. Everything you say, it's all just subjective experience. Well, my criticism's not subjective experience. A good criticism sets a standard and compares things to that standard. And that's what I try to do. And that's what I've been developing with this channel over the course of like 3 years, is trying to create good standards and measure things against those standards and make it clear what comparisons you're making so that you have an idea of where something fits. And you can say that one film is worse than another, it's less effective than another, it's more poorly made. There's lots of things that you could say are good or bad and are not subjective. They're not subjective because, some people have different levels of enjoyment experience. Of course, that's part of the subject. But when you create a standard and you try to accurately measure things against that standard, then you're engaging in criticism, and it moves it out of the territory of pure subjectivism and into a realm where you are making good comparisons. It's not as objective as measuring the temperature outside with a thermometer, obviously, but it's not full subjective either. So that's the thing. When someone makes an argument for subjectivity, when they're like, it's all subjective, they're making a nihilist argument. They're saying that there is nothing that is good or bad, nothing that is correct. It's a bit of a self-defeating argument. You can't really argue for nihilism because you're saying, well, I'm speaking the truth when I say that there's no such thing as an objective standard. It's like, well, your truth is an objective standard in itself. It's a self-defeating argument. So that has to kind of be kept in mind. But that's what I kind of think, and everyone kind of adopts this attitude that everything's subjective and nothing could be better or worse than other things, and you shouldn't make judgments on this and that, and you shouldn't judge other people. When someone says you shouldn't judge other people, they're saying don't apply standards. Well, standards are not subject specific. If I have a standard that says you shouldn't do this, if I decide it's a good standard to say we shouldn't kill people, well, of course I need to judge people who kill, right? That's a bad thing. Murder is not good, and I don't like murder. So I think that it's part of the symptom of the entire sort of West, is that we have a whole generation of people that lack deep values, the way that the greatest generation did, the generation that fought World War II, where you had to have really strong values because you're going to go out and fight and die for them. And you're going to go out and fight and die for your culture. Whether you were in Japan or you were in the United States, you had to have a strong belief in Japan or the United States and that your system was correct. And I think if you doubt the belief in the Japanese, I think you are not reading history correctly. I think that many of the soldiers felt very, very strongly about the correctness of their culture and all the things that went with that. It wasn't just like nonsense. Just because we've decided that we like our system better doesn't mean that they didn't also have that. That's part of the big conflict. So anyway, that's kind of what I think about with this, is like it's a strong message to me that like my sort of theory is insufficient, and I think nihilism's part of it and postmodernism's part of it. I don't think I want to go back and reemphasize one point. I don't think it's necessarily intentional. I think that people who are truly nihilists, you're basically a sociopath. You're not going to really be capable of of executing a story that includes a moral conflict, even if you can make cool special effects sequences. You can market test things, but you can't go from a gut level and say, I'm going to write a story about right and wrong. That requires humanity. So anyway, thanks so much for watching and for listening to my little diatribe on that. Leave me your thoughts down below on postmodernism and nihilism. The next question that we'll ask, and we'll have to address this in another video, is what is the solution? Because I don't like to just complain and not offer a solution. So I will try to think of some basic solutions. The most basic one is going to be stop giving money to people who make things that you don't like. And I've been saying that for a while. I went to go see the new Star Wars movie not because I really wanted to go see it, but because people really wanted my opinion on it, and I value that more than I value having to lead by example. And I've learned a lot through that process as well. So, oh yeah, and one of the things that I think of for evidence that there's nihilists in Hollywood, I want to add this a little bit. You can see it with a couple things, and Joss Whedon's a great example. Joss Whedon comes out and proclaims that he's a genderist, that's like a hyper super male feminist, and that he's for women's rights and all this stuff. And then privately, what does he do? Well, he cheats on his wife and he seduces really young women and uses his, pressures women into sex with him. Does that reflect the values that he espouses? No. So whenever you see this disconnect of those sorts of values, you have to think, well, he said something to get one thing, and then he did something to get something else. And so that indicates to me that he essentially has no moral base whatsoever. And he probably wouldn't feel a great amount of guilt about what he did, because that's just not something that sociopaths really feel. Likewise, if there's a vast feminist conspiracy in Hollywood, they're really doing a bad job, because the Hollywood appears to be full of sexual predators who in no way exemplify any kind of feminist values. So that's something interesting to think about, just to add on to what I said. And you guys have a great day. If you join my mailing list now, just to reiterate, like from the other videos, you will get a free copy of my upcoming book, Needle Ash, and you're going to get another free book right now called Water of Awakening that I released this year in 2017. They're both high fantasy works. Water of Awakening is more of a heroic fantasy, kind of adventure fantasy thing like The Hobbit, or more heroic fantasy stuff like Robert E. Howard. Then, of course, Needle Ash is going to be something entirely different, a little more political intrigue, a little bit different style, a little bit more limited in its geographic scope, but no less fantastical, as you will find out. So you guys have a great one. You'll get both books for free, Needle Ash, as soon as I finish doing the revisions and all that kind of good stuff. So have a great one, and thank you for the conversations.